started. Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many people here come out for a talk that we're really excited about and really looking forward to. My name is Kirsten from English. I'm in the History Department and the Jewish Studies program here at MSU. And I'm thrilled to see students and faculty and members of the community here, and particularly my students who are getting extra credit. You're all awesome, fantastic. Thank you all for coming to our talk, which we're really excited about. I'm going to announce our guest speaker in a second, but first I would like to just do a little promo since we have people here who might want to come back. On Wednesday, March 11th, from 7:30 to 9 p.m., Professor Yael Aronoff and Professor Eli Rakes, a visiting professor in Israel Studies at Northwestern University, will be discussing the Israeli election. Third time is the charm. We have flyers outside. Please consider coming to explain, I don't know, the third or the fifth election. So come and check that out. And then on Thursday, March 12th, Dean Vermund and Madeline Lenski will discuss the experience of Norway under Nazi occupation in an event called The Moon is Down, Unsung Tales of Rescue and Resistance under Norway's Nazi Occupation. That's Thursday, March 12th from 7 to 8:30. So please check those out. We also have surveys about this event, which is going to be fantastic. So please fill those out honestly and positively, and thank you for coming. So what I'd like to do now is to introduce our guest speaker. Devin Naar is Professor Isaac Alhadeff Professor of Sephardic Studies and Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at the University of Washington. His book, Jewish Salonica, won a National Jewish Book Award and the Grand Prize from the Modern Greek StudiesAssociation. These things are not easy to do. He is also the founder and chair of the Sephardic Studies program and has overseen the creation of the largest digital depository of Ladino texts in the world. That is 145,000 pages, waiting for students to start reading. And I have had the pleasure of knowing Devin for a few years, one year, it feels like more, but have really enjoyed getting to know him. He gave a wonderful lecture in my class, and I'm so thrilled that he was able to come here for our talk. So without further ado, I'm going to announce Devin Naar. And I've lost the title. Go back. There we go. Between the Ottoman Empire and modern Greece, the fate of Salonica, the Jerusalem of the Balkans. Please give him a warm welcome. Thank you.
Buenas tardes. Kalispera sas. Hi, how are you? Okay. Thank you very much, Kirsten, for having me and for inviting me. And thank you to the Jewish Studies program and to all of the other sponsors and everybody else who made my visit possible. I'm very grateful to be here. I'd like to begin, you maybe got a little preview of that in the next slide, but I'd like to begin by explaining a little bit about how I became interested in the city of Salonica, or Thessaloniki, and of the broader world of Jewish history in the Ottoman Empire, the Balkans, and Greece. And it begins with some questions about a lost world. My grandfather was born in this city of Salonica, and we'll see where that is on the map in a little bit later. But it was really the story of his uncle that particularly intrigued me. His uncle had come to the United States during World War I, and after the war returned, thinking that life would be better after the war and the new opportunities that would be available. It turns out that that was not necessarily the case, and he tried to get a visa for about 15 years, each year trying to apply for a visa, him and his family, and they were unsuccessful, and they wound up being killed during the Holocaust. And I didn't really know the particulars of that story, and this was not only me, but it was really evidenced in the broader dynamics in our family. While another one of my great uncles wound up submitting a page of testimony to Yad Vashem, that's the the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Israel. What really struck me about this document that was from the late 90s is all the places that unknown emerged. Date of death unknown, country of death, place of death unknown, circumstances of death, killed in concentration camp, Holocaust. I remember thinking, well, there have been so many books written about the Holocaust, so much documentation is out there. Weren't the Nazis such meticulous record keepers? How can it be that we don't have the basic information about the circumstances that surrounded the fate of my great uncle and his spouse, his wife, and their 2 children? This became a sort of starting point. Here's my family. The little boy on the far right is my grandfather. Shortly before they came to the United States in 1924, they were only with the brother having returned already to Greece and not coming with the family at the time. The only reason that my family was able to arrive at this time in 1924, immigration restriction had already come into effect in the United States, but my great-grandfather, pictured in the center, he was a rabbi, and so he was eligible for a special exemption that was available to ministers of any religion. So as a rabbi, he was able to get himself classified as a minister and was able to bypass all of the quotas, and he was able to bring his children along by fabricating their dates of birth and making them all a little bit younger so that they could all get on the same visa. But even here you can see the contrast in the generations between the older generation, my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother, and my great-great-grandmother, all dressed in the traditional Ottoman Jewish styles, even though the Ottoman Empire had no longer been operative in that city for a dozen years at the time. You can see the younger children dressed a la Europea, a la Franca, in the European style. Now, as I went to try to uncover a little bit more about what happened to my great uncle, and I was interested not only in his fate, but also the world that he returned to in Salonica, and I started to ask around, and I wanted to know, do we have any documents, do we have any evidence about what happened to Tio Salomon, to Uncle Solomon and his family? And one day, my great uncle brought to me we went into his closet, he pulled down a box from the closet, it was very dusty, he blew off the dust, and he opened it up, and he pulled out a small stack of letters. And one of the letters began looking like this. And what is going on here? I can't read this. I said, what is written here? He said, oh, this is Spanish. And I said, what? Yeah, come on, man, that's not Spanish. He says, no, it's our Spanish, Ladino. They call it Ladino. And these are letters. And I could look at the dates of the letters. They said 1938, 1939, 1940, and then nothing. And then the next letter begins in 1945, 1948, 1950. And I thought, well, maybe if I could uncover what these letters say, I'd be able to figure out what happened to Uncle Solomon and his world. Now, it turns out nobody in my family recalled how to read these texts either. And I remember bringing it to a rabbi who insisted that these can't be Jewish letters. These do not look like, this doesn't look like Hebrew. Maybe it's Arabic, maybe I'm Muslim, and I didn't know, this kind of stuff. And finally I went to the library, and I was able to find in an old book of Hebrew scripts a chart for Sephardic Hebrew cursive. And I sat down, I'm in college at this point, and I sat down and I did like hangman. I made little underscores and I tried to match the squiggly marks here with the Hebrew letters. Does anybody know the Hebrew alphabet here? A couple of people? Okay. First letter is on the top right. Don't be shy. I sort of set you up to be a little bit confused. First one is somebody. First one is pay. Second one you know. Vav. Third one is rich. Now what really throws people off is if you go to the second line, the second letter from the right, that long, tall letter. Does anybody know what letter that is? Looks like a lamed. Everybody's going to say lamed. It's an aleph. And it looks a lot like an Arabic alif. I don't know if you know Arabic. It looks more like an Arabic alif. So this took a pretty long time for me to figure out on my own. But it goes like this. Who can read this? So it goes like this. Por mis queridos parientes, caro papá. So it says, to my dear parents, beloved father. And these letters, as I was able to slowly piece them together, wound up revealing the situation of my family in Salonica on the eve of the war, and and also elements of their fate in the wake of the war. Now, I was able to kind of begin to decode these documents, and I was really captivated. I couldn't believe, first of all, that there was like nobody in the world that I could find to help me decode these letters, certainly not in the United States. And I was also fascinated by this world that seemed to be eclipsed from our collective memory about the Holocaust and also about Jewish history more generally. The Ottoman Empire and the Middle East, in certain respects, are not well integrated into the narratives that we tell about modern Jewish history, which tends to be European and to a certain extent American focused. I wanted to see if I could recover a little bit of the world of my great uncle and the world of the Jews of Salonica. And there was some scholarship that was available at the time. When I began, there was very little English. And the scholarship that was available was principally written from, we could say, from the outside looking in. So there were views of the world of the Jews of Salonica written based on consular reports from the American, French, and British consuls, or traveler reports, or a European school system correspondence about what was going on in this world. I wanted to see what did this world look like from the perspective of the people living in it, especially from the perspective of Jews, and especially how they understood the world in their own language, in this language, Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. Why were they speaking this language in the first place? For those of you who may not be familiar with this story, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. The rest of that story is, the dispossession of the indigenous populations of the Americas began, and the Jews were expelled from Spain. So that's really the story there. And the Jews, when they were expelled from Spain, many of them wound up finding refuge in the Ottoman Empire, and due to the structure of the Ottoman Empire, which I'll return to in a moment, they were able to practice their religion and also speak their language in exchange for certain taxes and other kinds of requirements. And so they continued to develop this Ladino language, which was based on Spanish, but like Yiddish, which is based on German and incorporated elements from the neighboring languages, Polish, and Russian, and other Slavic languages. Ladino incorporated many linguistic elements from Turkish, Greek, Arabic, all the while having an important Hebrew component to it. So I wanted to see, could we understand the story of this community on its own terms? So what did I do? I went to Salonica. And I remember asking the president of the Jewish community, do you have any documentation about the pre-war life of the Jews? And he said, no, we do not. Everything was stolen and confiscated by the Nazis. What is survived has been locked up in the former Soviet secret military archive. We have no idea what's there, and sorry, tough luck. And I had done some research. I knew that that wasn't quite the case. I knew that materials had been confiscated by the Nazis, but they had survived the war because they were brought to Frankfurt, where the Nazis had planned an institute for the study of the vanquished people. The idea was, wouldn't it be amazing if we collected all the cultural inheritance of a civilization, the Jews, that we, the Nazis, were to wipe off the face of the earth? So an act that was so intimately connected with destruction wound up contributing to the preservation of a section of the records and libraries of the Jewish communities of Salonica. I even found a shipping receipt in the American military archives indicating that 8 tons of books and archival materials pertaining to the Jews of Greece were located in Germany, sent to the port of Hamburg, and shipped back to Greece in 1947 and 1948. So I'm being told there's nothing here. How can this be? So every day I'm going into the offices of the Jewish community, this is about 15 years ago, and I'm meeting with different officials. The president doesn't want to help me, the vice president cannot come to a very strong sense of what is going on. And finally, one of the other functionaries in the community does me a big favor, and he sees what I'm asking for, and I explain to him, I'm looking for old papers. And he says, yes, we have old papers. He brings me to another community building. We go down the stairs, we go into a room, and there's a closet and it's full of old papers. It's like somebody took the records of the Jewish schools and the rabbinical council and correspondence with the government and civil registrations and all the other kinds of documentation that the Jewish community had, threw it up in the air, and it landed down and was in these sacks and boxes and crates like this. This became the basis of the book that I would write in combination with the other segments of the archives. I would go to Moscow and get access to some of the materials there, which have subsequently been microfilm by the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. I found other materials in Jerusalem at the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People, and I found other materials in New York at the Evo Institute for Jewish Research, in which they didn't have a very good sense of what they were doing. So what begins to emerge through my research, and what I tried to do was to try to recover the world of the Jews of Salonica. And it turns out that it is a community that has a very storied past, and one that representatives of that community sought to document during the period prior to the war. And here we can see from a rabbi from Salonica who writes in his Histoire de Salonica, the history of the Jews of Salonica in the 30s, a very kind of mythical characterization of the city. It was to Salonica that all of the great Jewish rabbinical families of medieval Spain migrated. Thus, the community maintained a kind of pride that is not found elsewhere. The Salonican Jew, upon leaving for another city, remains proud of his community like the Roman in the era of Augustus was proud to belong to the empire. It's very lofty imperial metaphors here. In effect, the Jews possessed in Salonica that which all the other Jewish communities of the diaspora lacked, Jewish liberties. Now notice what is going to be characterized as a Jewish liberty here. They operated a rabbinical police and a Jewish prison. So they had the freedom to enforce their own kind of laws, having a certain kind of self-government and autonomy in the Ottoman context. They operated like a state within a state in this guy's characterization. The Jewish Sabbath was that of the city. Each Jewish event left the imprint and character of the Jerusalem of the Balkans. Commerce, industry, customs, the port, leasing fees, and taxes were also in Jewish hands. So we get a sense of the very profound imprint and impact that Jews had on this city and on the broader society. And part of it had to do, as I alluded to before, with the broader dynamics of Ottoman imperial life, in which non-Muslims, there's a very large literature on this topic, but just to give you a basic idea here, that non-Muslims were granted certain privileges to reside in the empire, to practice their religion, to speak their language, to organize their community institutions in exchange for taxes and in exchange for the for the expectation of loyalty and to not rebel. And they could maintain kind of this a kind of degree of tolerance through recognizing and reinforcing the differences between the communities, Christians, Jews, and Muslims. So like if we take on the left, for example, we have a Christian, a Muslim, and a Jewish man. Anybody know who is who? You can notice they're all wearing kind of head coverings. We have various versions of turbans and kind of like a fez. Anybody want to take a yes? Yeah. Middle order Jewish. What gives you that impression? Okay, yeah, okay, yeah. That's a very good thought. Actually, the key, in both of these images, as to whom is whom, has to do with facial hair. So Jews and Muslims traditionally maintain beards. So, and Christians would have been the only ones to consider shaving at this particular juncture. So that leaves us with a Muslim and a Jewish guy on the two edges of the photo. Anybody want to wager? So the guy on the left is Jewish, and the guy on the right is Muslim. I don't know that Jews in the Ottoman Empire were known for being giants. This just might be this particular image. But it does give you a sense, like, you know, they're all wearing the kind of garb that might be available in the late 19th century. Now, when you overlay a kind of modern sense of political citizenship to the way in which the Ottoman Empire operated in the 19th century, there was an effort to transform these different Ottoman subjects into modern imperial citizens, each of whom would not only become loyal to the state and become good Ottoman patriots, but they would also maintain their status as members of their particular communities. In other words, there was no distinction, no contradiction between being a good Jew and being a good Ottoman patriot, being a good Greek and being a good Ottoman patriot. And this is represented with the declaration of the Ottoman Constitution in 1908, which happens to be proclaimed in the city of Salonica, which was a major city, and I'll get to that in a moment. And you can see on the right this gentleman wearing the fez, which was sort of the part of the uniform of the Ottoman citizen, the Ottoman male citizen at the time. And you can see various slogans about liberty, about the state in all the languages of the empire. So he's holding a flag in Ottoman Turkish, there's one in Ladino and Hebrew script, there's Armenian, there's Greek, and many different languages of the empire represented. And you even have the Marseillaise Salonicienne, the Salonican Revolutionary March. It says in Turkish, long live the nation, by which is meant the Ottoman nation. And what do we mean by the Ottoman nation at this point? The Ottoman nation is a collective, according to one pamphlet written in the wake of this revolution, that evolved from the coming together in one place of different peoples, like the Turks, Arabs, Albanians, Kurds, Armenians, Greeks, Bulgarians, and Jews, who all possess different religions and ethnicities. So the way that the Ottoman state is trying to define who its citizenship is very much not about everybody becoming the same, everybody assimilating together, everybody forgetting where they came from, pledging loyalty to the new nation, but it's about trying to wed those two identities together, and that will become a very difficult feat to accomplish. What is Salonica at this time? The turn of the 20th century, Jews constituted the plurality, if not the majority, of the population of the entire city. This was the most important port city in the entire Balkan Peninsula. 80 of its 170,000 or so residents were Ladino-speaking Sephardic Jews, and they could be found in every aspect of society in the city. You can see here on the right a hamal, a stevedore at the port, who would be lugging your imports or exports to and from your ships. Or if you arrive at the port and you're coming to visit, this kind of a guy would bring your luggage off the boat, and most likely this person was Jewish. We see on the left the tutungias, who are women, Jewish women in this instance, who were involved in sorting tobacco and rolling and producing cigarettes in the tobacco factory of Salonica, which was a very important industry at the time. But because Jews played such an important role in every aspect of the city also received the nickname of the Shabbatopolis, the city of the Sabbath, because the city closed from Friday night until Saturday night every week in observance of the Jewish Sabbath, the port and the commerce especially, due to the potent presence of Jews all throughout the city. This dynamic would be radically transformed with the end of Ottoman rule over the city and its incorporation into the Greek state during the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, in which Greece would succeed in annexing the city and incorporating it into expanded state, but that was not for lack of alternatives. And one of the most fascinating and little known alternatives to the annexation of Salonica by Greece was the proposal to transform the city into an independent Jewish state. What's fascinating about this is there was not only part of discussion in local circles in Salonica or the region, but it was something that was even discussed on the pages of the New York Times. You can see here in the blurb on the right, look, suggestion for Jewish autonomy in Salonica and Palestine, thought of together under guarantee of the nations as a solution of the problems arising from Balkan Turkish War and complications in Asia Minor. The logic went like this. There were more Jews living in Salonica than all of Palestine at the time, which was true. There was a much deeper Jewish institutional presence in Salonica than Palestine, and much more robust in the city than in Palestine. And that Salonica was a place in which there were representatives of the city seeking to recognize the Jewish presence in the city. The plan for the internationalization of the city, or for Jewish autonomy in the city, was even supported by Christian and Muslim members of the city. So it's a very fascinating dynamic. Probably you have never heard of the independent Jewish state of Salonica. The reason is because this plan did not come to fruition, but I think it is important to recognize as we consider the extent to which the way in which history moves is not predetermined, but there at any moment are different paths and different contingencies that bring us in one direction or another. Now, the city of Salonica will undergo some dramatic transformations as a result of the subsequent decade of war that would engulf the city. Not only the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, but then World War I, and World War I was followed by yet another war, a war between Greece and Turkey, a war that Greece lost. It's called the Great Catastrophe in Greek memory, and a war that Turkey won. It is called the Turkish War of Independence, because they won. In the middle of the Great War, the city is radically transformed due to a massive fire that burns down the center of the city, leaving 70,000 of the residents homeless, 52,000 of whom are Jewish. Over 30 synagogues are destroyed, 10 Jewish schools, numerous rabbinical libraries, and the entire face of the city is in ashes. The city is in ashes. And the new Greek government, remember, they've only been in control of the city for 4 or 5 years at this point. They see an opportunity to transform what had been a Jewish and Ottoman city into a Greek city on the premise of nationalist ideals, which imagine one nation for one people with one religion, one past, and one future. Salonica was going to become a Greek city for the Greek Orthodox Christian, Greek-speaking Greeks. Many Jews left the city at this time. Many others would move to the exterior of the city, to the suburbs, moving beyond the cemetery. You see where it says cimetière there in the right, that white spot? We're going to return to that in a moment. But that was on the outskirts of the city, and soon it would become the new geographic center of the city. How do Jews respond to this? And they respond in many different ways. There's an expression in Ladino, it exists in other languages, dos judíos, tres keilot. 2 Jews, 3 synagogues. In other words, many, many different opinions operating in Jewish culture, and that was represented on the political plane as well. So here I gave you a few examples of some of the Ladino newspapers that emerged during this period. There was La Acción Action, which was a Zionist newspaper, but it was Zionist insofar as it argued that Jews constituted a unique nation, and that they constituted a unique nation with their home in Salonica. Only later did they orient themselves more toward thinking about Palestine and thinking about the prospect of Jewish autonomy and self-rule in the land of Israel. You had a socialist, a very, very big socialist Jewish working class, and their newspaper was Avanti, forward. The tobacco laborers that I referred to before, some of those folks would be part of the Socialist Workers' Federation of Salonica, which was founded largely by Jews and was the largest and most important socialist and workers' organization in the entire Ottoman Empire and in the broader region, the founder of whom would subsequently become one of the founders of the Communist Party of Greece. And then we have a paper like El Pueblo, The People, which was really a localist paper. It was really concerned about what was going on in the city and about Salonican identity, strengthening Salonican identity. At the same time that these newspapers are coming out in Ladino, there's also increased pressure from the Greek state for Jews to adopt the Greek language. If you want to become Greek, the argument goes, you have to demonstrate that you are loyal and you are good citizens of the country, and this is a demand that is made of Jews all across Europe and of other non-dominant populations, and we can see that playing out with the birth of a new concept of Hellenic Judaism. That Jews can be both Jews and they can become Hellenes as well. So you can see the emergence of a Greek newspaper which says Kalo Pascha, which means, actually in Greek it means either Happy Easter or Happy Passover. It's the same expression actually. And then you can see on the right Judeo-Spanish Ladino declarations for Jewish men who were serving in the military. And what's interesting, you can see an effort, they're all in Ladino in that Sephardic Hebrew script, the Solitreo that I showed you before, but some people, if you have the choice, when you have an official form, and let's say you know multiple languages or multiple alphabets, what alphabet you choose to represent yourself is very, very powerful. It says something about how you want to be seen. So here we have a guy doing his best to write his name Greek. You can tell that he's not so comfortable doing it, but it's something that he does. What is the argument of the Salonican Jewish leadership at this time? They are confronted by many different cultural and political currents at the time that they try to weave together and blend to make themselves Jews who are Greeks, who are also Europeans, who are also part of the Salonican system. And what we're looking at now, you're like, what are we looking at here? We are looking at a postcard from a Jewish girls' orphanage from the 1920s. And I want to point out, I'm going to read this document with you a little bit to give you a sense of how the organizers of this organization are presenting themselves, projecting themselves to the world. This begins, top right here, with a Sephardic Jewish greeting for the new year, for Rosh Hashanah. Tizku l'shanim rabot. May you merit many years. This is the customary greeting among Sephardic Jews for the new year. Among Ashkenazi Jews, it's more common to say, what is it? Shana Tova, right, okay. Happy New Year, okay? So then you have the name of the orphanage in Ladino and Hebrew characters, okay? So again, this is a Jewish organization, Hebrew characters in Ladino, specifically Sephardic. Here we have the year, according to the Hebrew calendar, 5687, 1926, with the Magen David, a Star of David, and also the word Zion, Zion, written in Hebrew letters. It so happens that the organizers of this particular orphanage saw themselves as Zionists and were now starting to orient their view toward the land of Israel. But that's not all. We have the name of the orphanage in even larger letters in Greek. And we have it in French to say we're Greek and we're also European, French being the language of European civilization of the era. But we are also specifically Salonican, so they have the name of the place that they live. Salonica written according to the Greek name of the city, which is Thessaloniki. Then they have on the chalkboard the words teacher and student written in Greek and in Ladino. So again, this double identity here. And we have the teacher pointing to a map of Greece and the Balkans with her ruler specifically pinpointing the city of Salonica. So you see how all those different kinds of cultural elements come together in this one image. We are Jewish, but specifically Sephardic. We are Jewish, but specifically Sephardic and also Greek. We are Jewish, but specifically Sephardic and also Greek, but also Zionist. We are Jewish, specifically Sephardic, also Greek and Zionist, but also specifically Salonican, and we are also European. All of those different elements come together. And they believe that they could hold all of these identities without provoking an existential crisis or without incurring the ire of the Greek state or their neighbors. One of the reasons that they believed that this was a possibility for them was because the League of Nations had granted them minority protection. The idea was that there are populations living in Europe in the wake of World War I who did not get their own state. Therefore, they were minorities, Jews being the largest one of them, but there were also Germans living in Poland, for example, and a variety of other populations all throughout Europe and beyond. So according to the stipulations of the minorities treaties, the Jewish community of Salonica was able to maintain its status as a community. So whereas in many other parts of Europe at the time, the impulse and the demand was that you should assimilate, you should become a Jew a citizen of your state who just happens to be Jewish, a Frenchman who just happens to be Jewish, a German who just happens to be Jewish. That's not how it worked in Greece. In fact, the dynamics of the Ottoman Empire in which you could try to be both of these things, you could try to be a citizen and also a member of your community, were compounded and redoubled and codified in international law for the first time. So much so that the Jewish community of Salonica actually became a legal entity recognized by Greek and international law. The rabbis were recognized by the Greek state and had a certain kind of authority. And here you can see the offices of the Jewish community of Salonica, which included the rabbinical court and many other offices. They also believed that some of the rights that they had experienced in the context of the Ottoman Empire would also be safeguarded, like the Sabbath observance. But in the wake of World War I, that possibility was undermined due to yet another war I alluded to, the one that the Greeks lost, and it was the Great Catastrophe, and the Turks won, it was the Turkish War of Independence. As a result of that war, a major exchange of populations was orchestrated through under the auspices of the great powers sitting in Lausanne. And this was the idea. All of the Muslims, with some exceptions, were kicked out of Turkey, and all of the Muslims, with some exceptions, were kicked out of Greece and sent to Turkey, and all of the Orthodox Christians who were living in Turkey were kicked out and sent to Greece. This was the exchange of population. It was actually a mutually agreed upon, internationally sanctioned population expulsion. 100,000 Orthodox Christians arrive and are settled by the Greek state in Salonica with the express purpose of trying to transform the demography of the city once and for all, to transform what had been a Jewish and Ottoman city into a Greek city. It is under pressure from these newly arrived refugees from Turkey that the Greek state will impose a new law that will compel all of the residents of the city to observe Sunday as the day of rest. What does this do? It puts Jews in a very difficult position. This was a generally traditional Jewish community that everybody observed the Jewish Sabbath because this is what everybody did. Everybody kept kosher, ate kosher meat because that was what was available. Although some obviously also believed in it. But the Sunday closing law was seen as a major blow, and so they brought a petition to the League of Nations. They said, our minority rights are being violated. The League of Nations said, to paraphrase, we don't disagree that the spirit of the minorities treaties is being violated, but the letter of the law is not being violated. If you were being compelled to work on Shabbat, that would be a violation of the letter of the law. Now you have a choice. So it's a very clever backdoor way for the Greek state and under the pressures of this new population to transform the practices in the city. So there's this kind of direction going on of the way in which Jewish practices are changing, Jewish language instruction is changing, but at the same time, the Jewish community is able to gain some concessions and some advances from the Greek state. So here we have, for example, from the 1930s, a clipping that indicates that the Greek state will support the rulings of rabbis when it comes to marriage and divorce law. So rabbis, not the state, so if you wanted to get married in the Ottoman Empire or in Greece, you would have to go to your religious community, and you could only be married to people of your own religion. That was the case in the Ottoman Empire, and that would be the case in Greece until, does anybody know when civil marriage was introduced to Greece? 1982. Part of a requirement to enter the European Union, they had to introduce civil marriage. So that means until then, it was illegal for Jews to marry Christians, for Christians to marry Jews, for either of them to marry Muslims, with the one exception was if you converted to the other's religion, then you could be married. Right now, the marriage was an institution that was outsourced to the religious authorities. It was in part to maintain the Ottoman order, to maintain the separation of the populations. So this is sort of the paradox. On the one hand, the demands of the Greek state are become Greek, learn Greek, serve in the Greek army, die for the Greek state. But whatever you do, don't marry our daughters. This was sort of the rhetoric of the time. Don't actually become too Greek, like don't become of us. This created major, major tensions. At the same time, think about this law from the 1930s, where the Greek state says, if you violate what the rabbis have to say with regard to marriage and divorce, we, the Greek state, will put you in jail. I mean, this is a radical this exists nowhere else in Europe at the time. This may have existed, remember, the description of Ottoman Salonica with a rabbinical police and a Jewish prison. This is like that, except now it's even more so because it's now being under the authority of the Greek state. There were some observers seeing what was going on in Greece, some of whom were very impressed by what was happening here. On the one hand, there were some Zionist leaders who were passing by and were very impressed by what they saw in Salonica. They saw a unique sort of Jewish city, one of the only cities in the world where Jews occupied positions in all aspects of society, where the Jewish community had such strength. On the other hand, others saw this with a different light. The German foreign minister in 1937 comments in following terms. No racial mingling between Jews and the Greek host nation takes place in Salonica because of its special position. The Greek state is de facto, if not in the legal sense, inclined toward anti-Semitism. The Orthodox Church plays a major role in this true anti-Semitic inclination by forbidding intermarriage with Jews. Conversions to the Orthodox Church are rare. A feeling of foreignness exists between the Jews and the Greeks that is similar to that which National Socialist Germany, Nazi Germany, aims to achieve through its Jewish policy. In other words, interwar Greece was a kind of a model for Nazi Germany at this time, which is really a remarkable kind of thing. All of these pressures to maintain autonomy, to submit to Hellenization and assimilation, to sacrifice oneself for the Greek state, to maintain a sense of Jewish community, they all are swirling together during this period. Meanwhile, the Jewish community of Salonica is maintaining linkages with other communities across Europe and beyond. And this was one of the most interesting or striking documents I found, because it's in Ladino in that Sephardic Hebrew cursive, but you can probably see one word there, right? Which I've highlighted, Auschwitz. This is a document from 1940, and it indicates that for the Jewish holiday of Sukkot in the autumn of 1940, in order to celebrate that holiday, Jews require certain ritual items, one of which is a citrus fruit called the etrog, which was grown in the Mediterranean region, especially not in the region around Greece. And they were suppliers for other Jewish communities throughout the world. And what this is actually a receipt of the etrogim and the other items that were required in order to celebrate Sukkot that were sent to Krakow, and they were sent to Warsaw, and they were sent to a small town known in Polish as Oświęcim that had recently been occupied by the Nazis and had been redesignated as Auschwitz. There was a small Jewish community living there, and this was the last Sukkot that this Jewish community ever celebrated before what we know as Auschwitz emerged, namely the camps, gas chambers. And it was the last time that Jews in Auschwitz were able to celebrate this holiday, thanks to the ritual items that were sent to them all the way from Salonica in Greece. Now, as the Second World War by that time was already underway, Italy invades Greece and is repulsed, and many Jewish men are conscripted into the Greek army, and they serve in the army. Many die defending this Greek state, of which they have a kind of ambivalent relationship to. They feel part of it, but at the same time they don't feel fully embraced by it. And as the war continues, the leaders of the Jewish community make a very fascinating decision, which is they decide to publish a new textbook, a new prayer book to be used in the Jewish schools. This is an environment in which there is no separation between church and state. Religion is taught in the public schools. And so rather than have the Jewish students submit themselves to studying Christianity, Orthodox Christianity in the public schools, the idea was here, let's have a way for them to learn about Judaism in the public schools. So they create this prayer book in 1941, in the middle of the war. It's called Sharei Tefillah, Gates of Prayer, and it's in Hebrew. But what is also fascinating about it is the inscription right here, which I've included on the left. And it says in Ladino, in memoria del siempre regretado Shabbatai Amri Rafael Angel Cairo en el campo de batalla por nuestra querida patria la Grecia. It says, in memory of our much mourned Shabbatai Henry Raphael Angel was fallen on the battlefield for our beloved homeland, Greece. It's remarkable. And they say that in Ladino. In other words, this is not propaganda from the outside. This is not to show to the Greek state, see, look how patriotic we are. This is to show themselves. They published a Jewish prayer book in Hebrew with a Ladino inscription claiming that Greece is their homeland. You can see the occupation of the city, of the country, and I want to wrap up here with a few observations about the impact of the Holocaust on Greece, and you can read a lot more about all of this in my book at some point if you're interested. I would mention that Greece was divided into 3 zones of occupation: Central and Southern Europe under Italian occupation, North Central Greece, where most of the Jews lived around Salonica, under Greek occupation, and northeastern Greece was under Bulgarian occupation. And it should be mentioned that Bulgaria sought to annex that land on the grounds that there were Bulgarians living there, Slavic speakers, and it was actually the Bulgarian police that deported the 12,000 or so Jews from that part of Greece straight to their deaths at Salonica, rather than even the Nazis. The main first act of anti-Jewish policy that comes into play in Salonica takes place on a hot summer Sabbath day in July of 1942, in which the Jewish men aged 18 to 45 were all called to the center square, to Liberty Square. This is, by the way, the square where the Ottoman Constitution had been proclaimed in 1908, where the liberté, égalité, and fraternité are declared in that space. This becomes now the space which those rights are now being stripped away. Jewish men are sent to do forced labor for German munitions enterprises along the railroad and other places outside of the city. And this is where the story of the cemetery comes back to us. Remember, I had mentioned in the wake of that fire that the cemetery became the new center of the city. In the 1920s, the Greek state built the first building of the University of Salonica, and it was right on the outskirts of the cemetery, overlooking the cemetery. And the German occupation becomes an opportunity for the local authorities to implement a long-standing plan to Hellenize the city, to transform this Jewish city into a Greek city once and for all. This is not just any cemetery, I should emphasize. This was the largest cemetery, Jewish cemetery on the continent of Europe. It was the size of 80,000. It was the size of 80 football fields and contained 350,000 graves. The next largest cemetery, Jewish cemetery, was in Krakow, and it contained 175,000 graves. So it was enormous, literally a necropolis that had been on the outskirts of the city, but due to the demographic transformation of the city, the fire, the arrival of all of those refugees that I alluded to before, it was now the new geographic heart of Greek Thessaloniki, this Jewish burial ground, and it was coveted terrain. Already in the 30s, there was a campaign on the part of the municipality, on the part of the Chamber of Commerce, and on the part of the university administration to expropriate the Jewish cemetery to make way for an expanded university campus, but the Jewish community retained strong and pushed back against those efforts. They were mostly successful. You can see here a Greek newspaper from 1936 already making this argument. The German occupation provides the cover and the opportunity for the local Greek authorities to implement a plan that had been long in the making. In December of 1942, officials from the Greek officials, representatives of the university, meet with the head of the Nazi occupation forces and leaders of the Jewish community to decide what to do. The representative of the Jewish community points out, here are the old historic graves of the great sages who came to Salonica after 1492. Here are the newer graves, here are points it out. The German officer makes the decision. He says, okay, the Greek state and the university can have the new graves, but the old section that are of historic value will be preserved. He gets into his car and he goes away. The municipality is contacted by a Greek official who hires 500 workers on the dime of the city who come to the land of the Jewish cemetery and destroy it in its entirety. There you can see how vast, that's the university building. So you can see how vast the destruction is, including those historic graves. Marble became a very readily available building product. It was used to build homes, to line latrines, to pave pathways, to create the courtyard of the National Theater of Northern Greece, the cafeteria floor of the yacht club of Salonica. Instead of white picket fences, people appropriated marble tombstones from the Jewish cemetery to create fences with Jewish tombstones, some of which you can still see if you go to the outskirts of Salonica today. Here is a swimming pool built with Jewish tombstones that was to be used by Nazi officials with the inscriptions visible. Visible. The church of the patron city of the city, the patron saint of the city, which had been damaged in that fire of 1917, was finally refurbished using marble drawn from the Jewish cemetery. And here you can see in the late 40s piles of tombstones from the Jewish cemetery there. If you go to this church today, you can still see some of those tombstones there. Many were removed in 2004 for the Olympics, which were held in Greece at the time. Authorities were like, this might not look so good if people from all over the world are coming for a visit. They're going to see these tombstones with Jewish inscriptions on them. But some are still there. Stairs at the University of Salonica. The entire University of Salonica, which is the largest university in all of the Balkans, 80,000 students. It is exactly the size of what the Jewish cemetery of Salonica once was, with that one additional older building to the side. The destruction of the spaces of the Jewish living, which were, and this is very important, perpetrated by the local authorities and by local people under the cover of Nazi occupation, anticipated in some ways the fate of the Jewish living. And the story now will fall into the narrative lines of other stories of the Holocaust that you may be familiar with. Jews are confined to a ghetto in groups of several thousand. They are forced to wear the yellow star. What's fascinating about this image, which is one of the few images of a Jewish family in the ghetto of Salonica, is the smiles of the women down below, because they don't recognize what is in store for them. What was going on in Poland was not very clear. There were rumors, perhaps, but nobody was really clear. They were not aware of the fate that awaited them, so much so, and so deep was the deceit of the Nazi occupation forces that the Jews of Salonica were actually compelled to pay for their train tickets. Those train tickets would take them to Auschwitz. It was a 7-day voyage from Salonica up through the Balkans into Poland. And a Salonican survivor wrote a song about this experience in Ladino. I really can't sing, but I'll try to give you a little bit of a rendition of this song so you can get a sense for the Ladino. If you understand Spanish, you'll understand a lot of it, but also listen. There are words drawn from Hebrew. There are words drawn from Turkish. 7 días encerrados en vagones de fe en más. Una vez a los 3 días nos quitaban airear. Madre mía, mi querida, ya tuviste el zehut de morirte en tus tierras y no pasaste por el olor. Second column. Padre mío, mi querido, que te lo iba a decir, que vinieras con tu hermano al crematorio de Auschwitz. Padre, madre, hermano y hermanicas, saliendo todos rechachis, a el patrón del mundo, que me envíe salud a mí, que me quite de estos campos para vos echar Kaddish, que me quite de estos campos para vos echar Kaddish. What I find most remarkable about this song is the motivation to survive. what is the motivation to survive? It is not so I can see my relatives. It is not so I can go to my house and I can see my stuff. It is only to survive, to be able to say the Kaddish, to be able to say the mourner's prayer in peace and in solitude, and to give those who have passed away, have been murdered before him, a proper acknowledgement and commemoration. Over the course of a few months in the spring and summer of 1943, over 20% of the residents of Thessaloniki were deported from the city to Auschwitz-Birkenau, which represented over 48 or 49,000 people in a Jewish population of just over 50,000. The vast majority of the Jews were deported to Auschwitz, and the vast majority perished. In those letters and in subsequent documentation I was able to find in Salonica, I discovered that my great uncle and his family were on the 17th of 18 transports that brought Jews from the city of Salonica to their deaths in Auschwitz. Why were they there toward the very end? My great uncle Solomon had been appointed to the committee of the soup kitchen of the Matanot Levionim, which was responsible for providing sustenance for the poor and the needy. It was in his capacity as a member of this council that he was charged with the task of giving yogurt and milk to the sick and elderly as they boarded the trains to Auschwitz. And it's for this reason that he remained in the city nearly to the very end along with his family, saw the city liquidated, saw the Jewish community come to an end. Jews from Salonica and Auschwitz were at a great disadvantage. The climate was very different, but even more so, they could not communicate either with their fellow prisoners or with the German occupation authorities. They did not know German, they did not know Yiddish, they did not know Polish. It is for this reason, among others, that Jews from Salonica and Greece were disproportionately selected for the most gruesome labor at Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was that of the Sonderkommando. This was the brigade of Jewish prisoners who were responsible for transporting the corpses from the gas chambers and loading them into the crematoria and then disposing of the ashes. The Sonderkommando initiated one of the only uprisings in the history of Auschwitz, and Salonican and Greek Jews, including some who had been veterans of the Greek war against Italy, participated in this rebellion. And what's very fascinating is we know this from memoir literature. This is a story that has circulated. When those who rebelled, they succeeded in blowing up one of the crematoria, and they also killed a number of SS officers. But as you can imagine, they were quickly apprehended. And as they were being lined up for execution by firing squad, what did the Salonican and other Greek Jews do? Is they sang a song. What did they sing? Greek national anthem. Think about that. That's really a powerful thing. They had been deported from a country in which their status as Greeks was not quite clear. They had been deported from a country in which, when they were deported, their neighbors and the Greek state did not stand up for them, did not largely intervene. Why is it that they would sing the Greek national anthem? What does this tell us about the nature of national identity and national belonging? Was it to say, you Nazis, you think you have us here because we are Jews, but no, we are Greeks, or we are Greeks and we are Jews. We cannot be reduced. We may not know the answers. It was through these gas chamber and crematoria that the vast majority of the Jews of Salonica perished, my great uncle, my great aunt, and their 2 children included. On the eve of the war, there were over 50,000 Jews in Salonica. In 1945, there were only 1,000 who returned. I want to read you and conclude with one final poem here, which emphasizes among a survivor who comes back this sense of connection. And here the emphasis harks back to the center of Salonica as the heart of the world. The idea that maybe it's the city Salonica, not a state, not a country, not a region, not an empire that is truly home, but maybe home can be found in locality, in the lived experience of one's immediate environment. You can follow along in English with me. Thessaloniki muglikia, patrida doxasmeni, ach, pote tharfi okeros, nazume, que na supo ta vasi na putrabix aitutera, stis polonias ta stena, sto lagar, nichta, mera, to fonazo que kavhieme, ime Thessalonikios. I shouted loudly, and I am proud of it. I am a Salonican. At the end of the day, this was the identity that they claimed. Among all of the others, you can take away state, you can take away nation, but you could not take away the city. It should be noted that the Jews of Greece, which is not a typical geography we associate with the Holocaust, experienced one of the highest mortality rates of any Jewish population in Europe. Almost 90% of the Jews of Greece were exterminated, and close to 94, 95% of the Jews of Salonica. Today, there are 1,000 Jews in a city of 1 million. Of the 60 synagogues that once stood in the city, there is one that stands today. Of the 350,000 graves that stood in the city before the war, none remain. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
Yeah, please.
Do you want, should we?
I could do it. This round? Yes.
Or you could also.
I was going to say, we'll see how slow I am.
So, first of all, I'm just glad that you're living in the Northwest now, because I'm a Vancouverite.
Okay.
Of course, there's a beautiful Sephardic community in both Seattle and, of course, in Portland with Ahavadah.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So my family is actually from Corfu,
Okay.
to Egypt.
Uh-huh.
And so my question would be, did the two cities communicate with each other? And I mean, of course, Corfu has a very famous author, Albert Cohen.
Uh-huh.
That's actually my name.
Oh, is that right?
I had no idea when I Googled myself. This is the first thing that comes up all the time. I'm actually a mathematician. There's a famous French mathematician like Albert Cohen, so I'm kind of on here. But yeah, so did the two cities communicate with each other? Did the leaders communicate? And by the way, my family left Corfu and went to Egypt. And that, there was a lot of Jews, of course, that left Greece, went to Egypt. I don't know the whole story. I wish I did. I'm trying to find that out. But yeah, if you just tell me a little bit about the two cities and others.
Great, yeah. So Corfu was actually the center of the etrog trade, actually. So most of those citrus fruits that were required for the celebration of the holiday of Sukkot that I mentioned before, Corfu was a major center of that. Corfu has a very fascinating story because of a variety of different influences in the Ionian Islands. So there's a British influence, there's also an Italian influence. In terms of the connections between Salonica, the statutes of the Jewish community of Corfu, which are ratified in the early 1930s, are directly modeled on the statutes of the Jewish community of Salonica, and they were actually in quite close conversation. As part of the project of developing a Hellenic Jewish identity, the Jews of Salonica would wind up creating very close correspondence and create essentially congresses that would bring Jewish communities. There were over 20 Jewish communities across Greece, would bring them together to discuss what is the future of Hellenic Judaism. And in that regard, they would be very integral parts of that story. In terms of the story of immigration, because of the British connection, there was a stream of Jewish immigrants to Egypt because of also British rule there, and also Jews from other parts of Greece wound up in Egypt, in both Cairo and in Alexandria. In Cairo, there was a Salonica cafe at a certain point in the 1930s, for example. There were a number of Jews from Corfu who were involved in the Sonderkommando uprising as well. Those who stayed, also a number of them were deported, like the other ones that I mentioned. So it's a really fascinating and integrated history, and I'd love to speak more with you afterwards about it. Thanks for saying hi.
Okay.
I think maybe we can, I
I'm
can hear
not
it
sure the
without
mics are
that.
actually,
Yeah, right, yes.
I'm not even sure they're
Yeah,
working,
sure.
so just go ahead and
Yeah, I
talk.
can just project. So my question kind of pertains to this time, late 15th century, expulsion of the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. And you have this major population of Iberian Jews in Moriscos who go to Maghreb, Gambia, and Morocco, and they kind of are able to position themselves in upper levels of government, for example, so they're able to have a lot of these relationships with the native populations. My question is, what is the allure of, for example, Greece over an area like the Maghreb, which is just across the Strait of Gibraltar?
It's a great question. So the question pertains to what was the draw of Jews? Why did they wind up in the Ottoman Empire in what is now Greece and Southeastern Europe, as opposed to just right across the Strait of Gibraltar in Morocco, to which many Jews wound up after having been expelled from Spain? There's a lot of mythology surrounding this process. There is an apocryphal quote attributed to the Sultan Bayezid II, who essentially is said to have invited Jews to settle in the Ottoman Empire, with some apocryphal quip about how unintelligent are King and Queen Ferdinand, who are impoverishing their own kingdom by kicking out the Jews only to enrich my own. But there seems to have been a pre-existing Jewish community in the Ottoman Empire that encouraged Jews fleeing the Iberian Peninsula to come to that part of the world. There are already letters that are written in the 1450s by some Ashkenazi Jews and some Romano Greek-speaking Jews living in the Ottoman Empire to their brethren in Europe, informing them that the Ottoman Empire would provide an opportunity for them to live with some degree of protection and some prospect of economic opportunities. So it seems to be these are among the kinds of reasons. The other thing to mention is that the arrival of Jews in the Ottoman Empire, Sephardic Jews, after the expulsion from Spain in 1492, is a gradual process. So it is not a process that suddenly one day they're in, at the docks of Granada, and the next day they're at the port of Istanbul or Salonica. Jews will pass from Spain, many going to Portugal, from Spain and Portugal going especially to Italy, from Spain and Portugal going to Morocco, and from all of these places going to the Ottoman Empire from 1492 through the end of the 16th century and into the 17th century. It's stated that even there was a Moroccan congregation that was established in Salonica at the end of the 16th century. So it shows that these waves were, it was not a compressed time period, it was a gradual, prolonged kind of process of reconstituting Iberian Jewish life through passage via Italy, North Africa, and other places to the Ottoman realm. Yeah, sure.
In the wake of your remarkable research, have still other archives records become available?
So the question relates to the availability of archival materials. What I embarked on wound up being about a 10-year project in which I worked with the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., trying to reunite, at least by microfilm, and now we're working on it digitally, all the dispersed segments of the archives of the Jewish community of Salonica. So if you go to Washington, D.C. today, you can access many of the materials that I referenced. As part of the Holocaust Museum's International Archival Initiative, there have been efforts to digitize or microfilm a variety of different Greek state archives that provide or would provide, if people will begin to delve into them, many new perspectives on the relationship between the Greek state and its various Jewish citizens. And in some ways, the Jewish archives, the archives in Judeo-Spanish and Ladino, relatively unexplored. About 500,000 documents, all told. I did not read 500,000 documents in that script, I'm afraid to say. I tried to sleep once in a while, and, socialize, maybe occasionally. But there's a lot of material that is waiting for researchers and graduate students alike, and I hope to have an opportunity to go back to Salonica again to organize a workshop with some of the young scholars there who are finally, in the last few years, becoming interested in the Jewish history of their city, especially, you could imagine, more progressive kinds of folks who are interested in reclaiming a past that had largely been occluded by the overwhelming dominance of nationalist narratives, which both in the period that I described and still today don't really leave much room for thinking about cultural, ethnic, or racial diversity within the framework of the nation. Yes?
I have actually two questions. One, could you talk just briefly about why Seattle? I guess I just learned that Vancouver became a place where Sephardic Jews were coming. So why, how, which countries were they coming from? The other part of my question is anybody doing oral histories of the generations down from that community of Thessaloniki?
Yeah, so the two questions are about what's the story with Seattle and Sephardic Jews, and have people done oral, you said oral histories, is there oral histories with the older generation, I assume, is that what you're saying?
Or those who are younger who are trying to discover.
Those who are younger trying to discover.
The stories were passed on.
Great. So in terms of Seattle, it's I don't have a really, really good answer, and it's something that I hope to have a better answer for in the new research that I'm working on, which is about Sephardic migration to the United States. The first Sephardic Jews from the Ottoman Empire who arrived in Seattle arrived around 1903 from the island of Marmara, which is in the Marmara Sea not far from Istanbul. And the folk narrative is that they are alerted to new economic opportunities available by Greek friends from that very island who had been to the States and been to Seattle. So you've got to come and check out some new opportunities there. And the legend is that they arrive, they take the ship. I mean, it's very far to get there, and they take the train all the way across the country. And the story is that they arrived in Seattle, and they had a sense that it reminded them of the Marmara Sea, and they must have gone in the summer. I mean, otherwise it would have been raining, and less Mediterranean light. But that's sort of the folk story, the accepted story of how the first Sephardic Jews arrived. Others follow, especially from the island of Rhodes, and then from Istanbul and towns nearby. Very few come from Salonica to Seattle. Most of the Salonican Jews who go to the United States go to New York, New Jersey, and to a lesser extent, Los Angeles. Indianapolis, for interesting reasons. But that's sort of a story that I hope to cover further. But a very large community winds up settling in Seattle. Until a certain time after World War I, it was home to the second largest community of Ottoman-born Jews in the United States after New York. And now it's still the third largest community, and that's been one of the reasons why I've been able to amass such a large archive of Ladino texts. These have all been texts and books and family correspondence that were brought or acquired by Sephardic families who settled in Seattle. So we have more books have come out of the bookshelves and basements and closets of Sephardic Jews in Seattle than exist at the Library of Congress or Harvard University in the last few years. Almost none of which had been available online, but slowly and surely now we are making it digitally available. The next question about oral histories, it is something that some people have been undertaking for the last number of years. Some doing it from the disciplinary perspective of history, especially taking down oral histories related to the Holocaust experience, or life stories through the pre-war era. There are a number of Greek and Salonican testimonies that are available through the Fortunoff archive, through the Spielberg initiative, and also there have been a number of researchers both locally and from Europe and even the States, who have gone and undertaken oral histories. I've done a number myself. In terms of the younger generation, that's a really good question. There are a few younger folks who are very active in, I guess you could say they're sort of like memory activists. So they are very interested in pointing out and highlighting where Jewish properties used to be, where material from the Jewish tombstones have been used to build or refurbish different aspects of the city. A friend of mine who is a pharmacist by trade, he is like the tombstone superhero of sorts. He will go all throughout the city, identify tombstones, and repossess them by whatever means. And sometimes he keeps them in his pharmacy closet. Sometimes he brings them to the Jewish Museum eventually. The post-war the Jewish cemetery of Salonica, created after World War II, not only houses the Jewish dead who have died in the last 70 whatever years, but it also is a graveyard for Jewish tombstones. As detritus that's been collected from across the city, when it's uncovered or discovered, they bring it to this place. And you can go and see thousands of fragments of Jewish tombstones there today.
I wanted to take you back to 1923 population exchange. I was wondering if there was any effort to send the Jews, along with what they called old Muslims as Turks, back to Anatolia. Because in Turkey, there's this identity of being Selanik göçmeni among Jews. It became part and parcel of their identity, their memory. So I was wondering if there was any effort like that, and they became part of this population exchange, because the sentiments that, this area doesn't belong to you anymore, Turks and Jews out, and so whether that had any effect, and that was, decades before how you conclude.
Yeah, it's a really great question. As far as I've been able to see in my research, there was not a serious effort to expel or return or repatriate Jews to Turkey or to Anatolia, in part because the terms of the Treaty of Lausanne were based on religious affiliation. So it was Orthodox Christians or Christians and Muslims. So I don't see that as part of the discussion at the time, although some Jews do voluntarily leave Greece and go to Turkey. Quite a number of business people, for example, who had business in Anatolia, will go either voluntarily beginning in 1912 and some through the 20s. On the other hand, you see after, with the creation of the Republic, you see Jews from Anatolia coming to Greece, fleeing military conscription, for example, seeking refuge in the Jewish community of Salonica, petitioning to become members of the Jewish community. The one population in which their status is hotly debated are the Sabbateans, the Dunme, the descendants of the Jews who, following their messianic leader Shabbatai Tzvi in the 17th century, he converted to Islam under force of death at the initiative of the Ottoman Sultan, because, well, he was claimed to be the Messiah, and the Ottoman Empire the economy of the Ottoman Empire was being disturbed, but many other factors. He wound up converting to Islam, and a group of his followers wound up following suit and converted to Islam, and they formed their own distinct community based in Salonica. And they were known among themselves as the Ma'aminim, the believers. They saw themselves the true believers of the one true Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, Shabbatai Tzvi. They were known as Dunme, derogatorily in Turkish. It's kind of like the turncoats. And because they were officially Muslim, and the terms of the Treaty of Lausanne and the population exchange were based on religious grounds, they were expelled. And they were compelled to go to Turkey on the grounds that they were Muslim. Now, they petitioned to be exempt on the grounds that they were genealogically or racially Jewish. Some petition said that we should be counted, in this context, we should be counted as Jewish and we should be able to stay in Salonica in Greece. That was not successful, although some were able to get foreign protection, foreign nationality, and were able to stay in Greece for some time after. The libraries of the Ma'aminim were transferred to Salonican rabbis who safeguarded them, one of whom wound up bringing many of these manuscripts later to Israel, and they were deposited at an archive there that a very famous scholar named Gershom Scholem eventually accessed and used those manuscripts as the basis for his history of Sabbatianism.
As I recall, a few years ago, there was a survey of worldwide anti-Semitism, and the findings were that most anti-Semitic countries in the world were certainly Muslim nations, but that after that, the highest anti-Semitism was in Greece. So, first, do you think that's accurate, and if so, how would you explain it?
Well, with any discussion about anti-Semitism, of course, the first question is, what do we mean by anti-Semitism? I'm not going to answer that question in 2 seconds right now. But I will say that, yes, I am familiar with that survey, and there have been others before and since that affirm the extent to which anti-Semitic ideas have permeated Greek society and continue to do so. It is, I would say, pretty common in Greece for people to believe in Jewish conspiracy theories, Jews and bankers, Jews as bankers, world finance, how do you explain the financial collapse, the Jewish conspiracy, these kinds of ideas you can see. So the sentiment of the Protocols of the Elder Zion is very well disseminated. You can buy it, as in Turkey, at regular bookshops in different parts of the country. Part of the sentiment is a first layer of Christian church anti-Semitism. The idea of Jews as Christ killers is something that is operative still today. But there's also another element which has a double side to it. Greece was the last country to recognize the state of Israel, in the last country in the United Nations to recognize the state of Israel. Does anybody know when Greece recognized the state of Israel? 1990. Okay, so until 1990, Greece didn't have formal diplomatic relationships with Israel, and part of this was out of a desire on the part of Greece to protect the Greek populations living in the Arab lands. So we mentioned Egypt earlier. There were many Greeks, like Greek Orthodox Christians, living in Egypt especially, but other parts of the Arab world. So this is one sentiment and one reason to think about that. That's not necessarily anti-Semitic, but it is related to perception about Jews. That has essentially flipped that sentiment, the relationship between Greece and Israel, in part as a result of the Mavi Marmara incident, if you recall, a few years ago, the Gaza flotilla, the Turkish flotilla to Gaza that wound up being a big catastrophe and a kind of a minor international crisis, and that really hardened Turkey-Israel relations. Turkey and Israel had a very strong relationship, military partnership in the region, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of sentiment wound up enabling a warming up of Greek-Israel relations for two reasons. One, there is a military reason for security in the Mediterranean. Relatedly, an economic reason. There's now plans for a new gas pipeline that would connect Israel, Greece, Cyprus, and then funnel that gas into Europe. It's anticipated to be billions of dollars an enterprise. But the flip side of that, pro-Israelism, is actually an anti-Semitic idea, which is that the Jews, and this you can see this in the paper, the Jews are very smart, and the Jews are very successful, and the Jews are very innovative, and we want to be like the Jews in Israel. We want to have technology, we want to have innovation, we want to have a strong economy, and we want to have a really good ethno-national state. So, like, that's also part of the rhetoric there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Wow, perfect time for the